This section will introduce you to the basics of pivot tables and show you some of the fundamentals before we dive deeper into other concepts later in the course. All pivot tables start with data of some sort. Often it starts with data stored right in the spreadsheet, similar to what you see here. Of course, we can also import data into the spreadsheet from other spreadsheets or databases within your organization and use that to create a pivot table. Or we can import it directly to a pivot table itself. The data that we have here comes from Johnco, a small company with 3 locations in Phoenix, San Jose, and Denver. Johnco sells a variety of different items and has a number of sales reps working for them. You can see here that each row represents an individual transaction. In this case, Sally sold a toy in Phoenix on September 1st for the amount of $15. These other 2 columns, sales approach and service satisfaction, we'll get into a little bit later. So let's get to it. How do we actually create a pivot table? Well, the first thing you need to do is actually select some cell within your data. Now, it doesn't really matter if it's a header or an item, a field in a different row, but if your data is set up so that it's all contiguous, that'll make things just a little bit easier. So what you want to do is to create a pivot table is you want to come up to the Insert menu and come over to Pivot Table and left click on that. As you do that, this dialog will ask you for 2 different things. First, it'll ask you what data you would like to analyze, and then secondly, where you want to store the pivot table that's going to be created. So in this case, because we have contiguous columns or columns that are right next to each other and rows right next to each other, it takes a guess of where our data is and it gets it correct. Now we're going to just go ahead and accept the defaults to create a pivot table in a new worksheet. As we do that, you'll notice 2 things. You'll see the main pivot table on the left-hand side over here. On the far right-hand side, you'll see the fields that you can use to construct your pivot table and a couple different areas where you can place those fields. In order to use this, you'll simply select a field and you'll drag it down to one of these spots. Now, before I do that, let me quickly explain each one of these. The columns area is where you'll put items that you want to go across or headers in your report. And the items, if they're dragged down to rows, will do exactly what you thought, create rows for your report. The values area right here is what you're going to actually summarize. So in this case, maybe we'll summarize here in just a minute the amount of cells for different categories. So you can create pivot tables very easily. We can come here and say, well, show me all the sales reps, and you can just, check the check mark here. If you use this check mark, you'll see that sometimes it'll go to rows, sometimes it'll go to values. Excel essentially tries to guess where you want it. So instead of doing that, I'm in the habit of simply grabbing it, dragging it down, and dropping it there in that area. So as we drag sales reps down here, you can see that the pivot table created a unique entry for every single sales rep that we have in our data. Now, if you want to get rid of that, you simply hold the left click down and drag it away. And it doesn't really matter. You don't have to go up here. You can just come to the side, but you let go and you can see now that your pivot table is cleared. Let's say we wanted to look at location. Well, we can do that as well. Now, the cool thing about pivot tables is that you can put multiple fields in any one of these different areas down here. For instance, if I wanted to see sales reps that have sold at different locations, I can simply grab sales rep and drop it under location. And you can see here now that Denver has Dan, Emma, Ken, and Steve, Phoenix, others, and San Jose, others. It looks like we probably have, for example, Ken working in multiple different offices, but that's fine. You can very easily determine who's working where with pivot tables. Of course, they're a lot more powerful than that, just that too. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that you can take your sales rep and you can actually drag it above location. This will show you each sales rep and then the locations where they work. And indeed, we see that Ken is working in a couple locations, Maddie is as well. Okay, let's go ahead and get rid of sales rep and let's find a field for our column. We're going to use sales date for that. So I'm going to drag that down, drop it in columns. What you'll see here is that you'll see the dates automatically grouped into months for you. Now this is a new feature in Excel 2016, so if you're not using Excel 2016, you probably have something that looks more like this as I drag months away from the columns column. You probably have individual dates. Well, individual dates isn't going to be that helpful. So we want to group those so that we can consolidate all the transactions for a given month. And to do that, I'm simply going to right-click on one of those dates, and I'm going to come down here to group, and I'm simply going to unclick days, and I just want months to show. And in that case, you get something that looks similar. I'm going to go ahead and step backwards just a moment. So those that are on 2016, you'll see something like this. It automatically groups it for you. Looks just slightly different here. Okay, now we need to find something to go into our values area. And this is the value that's going to be summarized in our pivot table. We're going to start out with using amount. Now, I just drag that down and Excel actually guesses what I might want it or how I might want it to summarize. In this case, if you hover over, you can see that it's the sum of the amount. Or in other words, in Denver for September, we had a total sales of $393. Which one was our best month? You can see it right there, October in Phoenix. So pivot tables allow us to easily drag and drop different fields into these rows, columns, and values, and we'll talk about filters later, in order to answer questions relatively quickly, things that would be useful to our business or organization.